We are going to discuss today the issue of nationalism as an instance of ideology. And it is indeed an ideology. It is indeed an instance of ideology. A scholar, his name is John Bruley, he said quite correctly that the most important political ideology of the modern era is nationalism. So nationalism is one of those isms that we were discussing last time. And it has been particularly well demonstrated by this scholar, whose name is Benedict Anderson. He has written a book which became extremely influential. It's called Imagined Communities. His point is essentially that what brings people together, what makes them feeling that they belong to one nation, it's an idea, it's an imagination. So there is no a real objective thing that makes people belonging to one nature. It's subjective. It's the way how people imagine themselves. And he demonstrates this by an example that say, if you take people from New England and California, what would bring them together? They never met each other, they don't know each other, and they bring them together to the same to support the same cause. This exactly imagined an idea of belonging to one common thing, which is completely imagined. So nationalism is built, evolves around the idea of belonging to one thing. It doesn't mean that it is a real thing, but sometimes, it's as an idea, it is a real thing. But in a sense that it's not something that we see like our home, our household, family. When we support nationalism, we essentially support an idea which we cannot see materialized in something around us. That is essentially the point of Benedict Anderson. And this makes nationalism belonging to the same family of social and political phenomena than any other ideology belongs to. As we said, ideology runs around an idea. So that an idea drives people to something which is beyond their everyday life, which is sometimes beyond their immediate existence. Ideology can drive people to kill each other or to be killed, to sacrifice themselves. And this is exactly the case of nationalism as well, because nationalism drives sometimes people to sacrifice themselves and to kill other people. Nationalism is an ambivalent idea. It's an ambivalent phenomenon. It's not necessarily bad, and it's not as good as many who subscribe to it believe. So it is really a complex phenomenon, and we are going to consider this complexity, especially from the perspective of our subject, Eastern Christian traditions. And indeed, nationalism is a widely spread phenomenon among the Eastern churches. It is believed to be the most common disease among the Eastern Christians. Moreover, nationalism has become identified with the Eastern churches. So when you meet an ordinary people somewhere and ask him or her what is his or her idea about Eastern Christianity, in many cases the response would be they are nationalist, and the churches are really nation-driven and nation-concerned. This problem has been recognized, and it is indeed recognized by the Eastern churches themselves. And we like to say that, nationalism is bad, but what happens, we cannot do anything about this. We don't really change the situation. We accommodate nationalism as it is, and this is a sort of dichotomic, a sort of even schizophrenic situation when we, on the one hand, condemn nationalism. We realize that it is bad, it is harmful, and on the other hand, we really endorse it by supporting the structures shaped by nationalism, by supporting the popular moods, by supporting, by accommodating the popular feelings of the people. Well, this is the case in the most churches, Eastern churches. There are churches, though, which say that no, it's okay to be nationalist. It's okay to have this, to support this nationalist agenda. For instance, I can mention, for instance, the Armenian Church. They're pretty fine to be Armenian. They're pretty fine to be confined to a nation. They say, we don't care about who is not Armenian, whether they belong to the church or not. We care that every single Armenian belongs to the Armenian Apostolic Church. Of course, then they say, as kind of half joke, all good people in the world are Armenians, but not everyone understands this, realizes this. It's a kind of a joke, but really they don't care to be a nationalist, to be really confined to a single nation. The same one can say about the Romanian Church. They care that every single Romanian belongs to the Romanian Orthodox Church in the world, and that is somehow their priority. For instance, in the discussion that we had recently, there was a Pan-Orthodox Council in Crete in June this year, and there was a discussion about nationalism again and again. We come again and again to this topic, and it was again condemned at the council, but the Romanian Patriarch said, well, we should be cautious not to exterminate good nationalism, which he called patriotism. So it's another issue, how we distinguish between patriotism and nationalism. And some churches just confuse these things. And it is particularly depicted here. Here you see a picture from a procession which is patriotic. It's in Russia. It's patriotic, and at the same time it has a very distinct nationalist agenda. To understand the nature of nationalism, we need to go to theories about it. The nationalism has been studied extensively since at least 1960s. A few schools of studying nationalism emerged, and essentially they are grouped into two directions. There is a school which is so-called pre-modern, and a school which is modern. The first school, the former school, pre-modern school, it holds that nationalism had some pre-modern forms, that it existed always. It is pertinent to the human culture. It is pertinent to the human society. You cannot get rid of it. And this school finds traces of nationalism, the pre-nationalisms, in the history before the Enlightenment, before the era of modernity. The other school, the modern school, it holds that nationalism is essentially a modern phenomenon. It emerged in the 17th, 18th century. It has become a fruit of secularization. It was produced by the Enlightenment, and there was no nationalism before the modernity. The second school, the latter school, which supports that nationalism is essentially a modern phenomenon, constitutes a majority. So most scholars subscribe to this school. The minority say that no, there were traces of nationalism before the modernity. And the pre-modern school, it brings up several examples of the pre-modern nationalism. Like, for instance, this is the beginning of modernity, this era, the beginning of the 17th century. And John Milton had already expressed some nationalistic feelings, sentiments, like in this phrase, that the English nation is chosen before any other, like Zion, and enjoy God revealing himself primarily to them. There is a scholar of nationalism, Eric Hobsbawm. He passed away just recently, I think a few weeks ago. He was British, and he argued that the earliest form of nationalism, he's a modernist and a theoreticist, so he thought that nationalism is a modern phenomenon. And his point was that the English nationalism was the earliest one. It gave birth to any other nationalism in the world. And this phrase of John Milton is an illustration to this theory. If we go earlier, if we go to Italy, we find in the writings of Girolamo Savonarola, a famous Florentine monk and ruler. He established a sort of theocracy in Florence in the 15th century, and he also encouraged and inspired people of Florence by saying that Florentines are the elect nation. That's how you actually drive people to support you. You say that they are elect, they are special, they have a special mission. That's what exactly Savonarola did, and this constitutes, I think, and the pre-modern scholars think that this constitutes an early pre-modern form of nationalism. Well, and a scholar, also he's British, Anthony Smith, in support of this idea of pre-modern nations, coined a term that he thinks more correctly describes those proto-nations, initial early nations. He calls them ethnies. And for instance, he suggests that such ethnies were, say, in France, which called itself Most Christian Kingdom, Catholic monarchy of Spain. Well, there were German nationalism driven by the Reformation, and essentially the Reformation inspired nationalist feelings among the German nations. In Holland, there was a Zion. The Dutch people regarded themselves the new Zion, and this was particularly the case after the Reformation. So the Reformation also gave people a feeling that they have a very special mission from God, and this mission makes those people who were endowed with this mission special. Well, this was the case in the United States, in America. The theocracies of New England were driven also by ethnic nationalist feelings. Just an instance is the famous Cotton Mather. Have you heard of him? He was a writer who tried to demonstrate to his contemporaries why the cities of New England, which were established as theocracies, as embodiment of the Puritan vision of polity, of how politics should be done in accordance with the Bible. He essentially, all the time surprises.
Someone's got to walk up and down the aisle.
But
it's a motion sensor.
Okay. So he essentially contributed to a local nationalism, American nationalism, which grew out of this Puritanic vision of the early settlers. And I just want to mention, to quote him from his treatise, which he called Theopolis Americana. He wrote particularly about Boston. Glorious things are spoken of thee, O thou city of God. He meant Boston. The street be in thee, O New England, the interpretation of it be unto you, O American colonies. There are many arguments to persuade us that our glorious Lord will have an holy city in America, a city the street whereof will be pure gold. Yeah, the day is at hand when the voice will be heard concerning thee, put on thy beautiful garments, O America, the holy city. So this is a sort of indoctrination, essentially, which inspires national feelings. And in all those cases that we've just mentioned, you see there is a religious background. There is a religious feeling that sublimates itself into a national feeling, into national sentiments. Yes?
So does that usually lead people to think that their nation is like the chosen nation?
Yes, they begin with the idea that they are chosen. Okay, that this idea comes from God. They say God chose us for his own reasons. We don't know why. Maybe we are worthy, maybe we are not, but we are chosen. It has to do also with the Calvinist idea of chosenness. And especially, and interesting, these Puritans, including Mother, they were of Calvinist background. So this chosenness comes first, and then it transforms itself into the national feeling, into nationalism, essentially. So when this religious chosenness gets secularized in the secular context, it turns into the stiff, dry nationalism. So nationalism is essentially the complex of religious, kind of ethnic feelings minus religion. But the thing is that the nationalists can affect back their religious consciousness, can come back to religion and can infect religion with nationalism. So it's a sort of dialectics that nationalism stems from the religion, from the religious kind of exceptionness. Then in the secular form, it becomes an ideology, a secular ideology, nationalism, and then it affects back religion. And at this third stage, a religion becomes nationalist again. This is exactly the case with the Eastern Christian churches. Most of them, they were affected by the secular nationalism. Okay? Any question? So we go back, go further. If we take the Eastern Christian milieu, especially in the first millennium, we find quite a number of instances which we can identify as proto-nationalisms or ethnies in the terminology of Smith. We have discussed some of them as identities. So the Roman identity of the people who lived on the territory of the Roman Empire, whether it was the western part or eastern part of the Roman Empire, the Roman identity constituted the first instance, the earliest instance of nationalism. Then another instance, another identity, the Armenian, for instance, it was also a proto-nationalism. Syrians, initially they meant territories. They didn't mean blood. It was a nationalism of land, not nationalism of blood. But gradually the nationalism of land turned into the nationalism of blood. So initially people who lived on the territory of Greater Armenia, for instance, which covered most part of the Asia Minor, they were Armenians. But then they immigrated to different parts of the Roman Empire, and they retained this Armenian identity, and thus the identity of the nationalism of land turned into nationalism of blood. Okay? The same is with the Persians. There was a Persian identity among the Christians. So there were Christians who identified themselves as Persians. First, it was an identification of the empire. They were in the Persian Empire, but later on, they just by their origin, they came to identify themselves as a sort of nation. Later on, in the beginning of the second millennium, new identities, new nations, so to say, emerged. The Bulgars, Serbs, they were not nations in the sense of the 19th century. They were not ethnic nations, but they denoted a commonwealth of people who they had Roman identity upon themselves. The Bulgars, actually almost all of them, the Armenians had Roman identity. The Syrians not, Persians not, they were just a rejection of the Roman identity, but Bulgars and Serbs, they were Romans, they identified themselves Romans as well. And they built their empires in the 12th, 13th, 14th century as the empires of Bulgars and Romans, or Serbs and Romans. So it was still pre-modern era, but there were already some kind of ethnic feelings. It is a mistake, of course, as many scholars and just political figures in those countries like Serbia, Bulgaria, or Romania have, that they trace their nation back to the centuries, to the pre-modern era. They say there were always Bulgars, or there were always Serbs, there were always Romanians. It's a mistake because at that time people didn't have this kind of awareness, ethnic national awareness. They were aware of themselves as Romans, but of course they had some additional identity like Bulgars and Serbs. So it's a mistake to project our modern concept of nation to the past, to the pre-modern era, because nations didn't exist at the time. And in this regard, the modern theory about nationalism is right. On the other hand, I think, it's my personal opinion, is that you can find some preliminary nuclear, so to say, some embryos of modern nationalism in the past. And in the pre-modern era. And in that era, nationalism had a very distinct religious dimension, always, with no exception. Well, the Ottoman, in the end, I just listed the Ottoman version of nationalism, the early pre-modern nationalism, which was called millet. It's a Turkish word which means a group of people which has a common identity for themselves, and they are accommodated within the Ottoman Empire. When the Turks captured the eastern part of the Roman Empire, Byzantium, they tried to digest the populations they found there. The majority of those populations were Christians, so the Ottomans had to deal with a huge crowd of educated, irritated people and religiously concerned people who wanted to preserve their religious identity, who wanted to preserve their religion. And the Turks did not start purging them. That was impossible solution to kill all of them, then whom to rule? And they had to accommodate those people. And the way how they found how to accommodate those people was the system of millets. So millets are organized, self-organized communities against the religious criteria. So all people, regardless of their language, of their culture, who belong to one religion were counted as members of one millet. Say, all the Jews were grouped into one millet, which was called Yahud Milleti. All the Oriental churches, like Armenians, Syrians, Ethiopians, Copts, they were included to one millet, which was called Milleti Armenian, after Armenians. But essentially, this millet included not just Armenians, but also other non-Chalcedonian groups like Copts in Egypt. Finally, the Byzantine Orthodox constituted the Milleti Rum, the Roman millet. And they included all Greeks, Slavs, Armenians who belonged to the Byzantine churches. So all of them were grouped into this millet. And only in the 19th century in Turkey, they created a Roman Catholic millet, which was called Catholic millet. So it's a late formation. Initially, there were 3 millets. So these millets, they were like states within the state. They were self-organized. They had their own juridical system. They had their own judges. As far as the cases included, on both sides, included the people from the same millet. If, say, the case was among a Greek and a Turk, then the Turkish authority judged those cases. When the quarrel was between a Greek and a Greek, then the local judges dealt with these cases. And in most cases, the local judges were the bishops. So bishops and the patriarch, particularly the patriarch, were endowed with the political and the spiritual authority over the millet. They had their own system of taxation within the millet, and actually the millet took care of taxing people. So there were tax collectors appointed by the millet to collect taxes, but the taxes went to the Turks. So millet was a kind of early instance of nationalism. It was not nationalism yet. It was not an ethnic identity. We see how in one millet there were different nations, so to say, like Greeks, Slavs, Bulgars, Serbs, in one Roman millet. Or in the Armenian millet there were Copts, Armenians, Syrians, and so forth. But millets became a ground from which, a soil from which later nationalisms emerged in the 19th century. So we see how nationalism emerged not out of scratch, but from some pre-existing conditions, from pre-existing social groups, social and political groups. Okay, is it clear? And then the Enlightenment came, and the Enlightenment certainly changed the game completely. The Enlightenment created preconditions for emerging of nationalism in the present sense of the word. This was a secular phenomenon. This nationalism is secular in its nature, and it had, well, scholars who support the idea of modern nationalism, they trace different economic and social political roots of the modern nationalism. Like one of them, Ernst Gellner, he believes that nations were not organically grown from the past; they were just invented. Just like an idea in the general framework of ideologies that were invented in the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. In the same sense, nationalism, national identity was invented. Eric Hobsbawm, whom I already mentioned, he believed that the French Revolution gave a push to nationalism together with capitalism. And Anderson, he believes that the change of the writing customs from Latin to local languages contributed to the emergence of modern nationalism. So when the Latin language was commonly used in Europe, there were no preconditions for nationalism like French or English or Italian, because everyone used the same language, for writing at least. But then afterwards, after someone can work. Good. So after every nation became using its own language, this contributed to the growing of those nations. As a concept, nationalism was developed as early as in the 18th century by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the famous thinker of the Enlightenment, of the project of Enlightenment. He made nationalism, or the concept of nation, a part of his social contract concept. The idea of the social contract is simple. Maybe some of you know it already. Initially, before the Enlightenment, all the people in a state accepted the authority of the sovereign because it was given from God. The authority stemmed from God. The sovereign, the king, he or the queen sometimes, she exercised their power and people accepted that power because people believed that this power comes from God. At the Enlightenment suggested a new model of accepting authority. This was a model of social contract. When people accept something, the authority from above, not because this authority comes from God, but because they want to. They want to accept the authority of the person. Hence, is importance of elections, because how can I accept something that I don't contribute to? Hence comes the idea of nation, because now that I elect my sovereign, I elect my master, means that I join the common cause. I join the group of the people who also elect the same master, okay? And we sign a sort of contract between each other and with the master, that I support the master together with others, and it means that I need to accept what he or she tells me to do. This is the idea of the social contract, which meant the downshifting of the power of the authority from God to the body of people, to the social body. And Rousseau faced the problem that it's not enough that we join this, we sign, I as an individual, sign this social contract for me to accept the power of the sovereign. Because not everyone is so conscious, not everyone is so civically aware, politically aware about the political responsibilities. And Rousseau, for those who are not enough politically responsible to sustain the social contract, he suggested two things. First thing is civil religion, that people should obey the master's new authorities in the framework of a sort of civil religion. And second, they should obey the master because they belong to the same nation. So civil religion and nation became the forces that drive people together to sustain the social contract that they have signed. Okay? Is it clear? Hence is the idea of nation. Nation is important, is an important part of the social contract, according to Rousseau. And that's why nation, the political idea of nation, the political importance of nation, was born in France, even though Rousseau was in Switzerland. He was Swiss actually. He lived in Geneva. But it became important in France, in the Republican France after the French Revolution, and from France it spread to other countries, including the Eastern Christian countries. And this guy is particularly important for the dissemination of the idea of Rousseau to the Ottoman Empire. His name is Adamantios Korais. He is Greek. He studied medicine in the south of France, in Montpellier. He became a writer, and he is a kind of, nowadays, a main figure, considered to be a main figure of the Greek Enlightenment. And his ideas were exactly nationalist. He suggested, he supported the idea that nationalism is something that the Greek nation needs in order to liberate itself from the Ottoman Empire. So nationalism was used as an instrument of liberation, of emancipation of the nations within the Ottoman Empire from the imperial authorities. It's interesting that unlike, say, Rousseau, who was irreligious himself, Rousseau was not a religious person, even though he supported the idea of civil religion for weak people. The same nationalism was for weak people, according to Rousseau. But still, the majority of people are weak in the city or in the state. That's why Rousseau said that we need civil religion and we need nationalism for those people. But he believed that it's just a way of manipulating people's religion. He himself did not believe in religion. Korais was a believer. He was not irreligious. He was not atheist. But still, he supported the idea of enlightenment, and he supported the idea of nationalism for the Greek people, for the Greek nation. And these ideas became extremely fruitful. They actually destroyed the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a big sick of Europe, as it was a common phrase. And it decayed all the time. It decayed from the 16th century. It was in the phase of decay somehow, and the nationalist ideas just enhanced this process of decay. And eventually, very soon after the ideas of nationalism penetrated the Ottoman Empire, it collapsed eventually. This happened after the nations that accepted for themselves nationalistic ideas, like Greeks, Bulgarians, Serbs, Romanians, they separated from the Ottoman Empire, and this led to the demolition of the empire. And this happened because of the ideas of such guys like this one. And this what happened as a result of the dissemination of the nationalistic ideas. The Ottoman Empire, which was huge, here you see it, split into pieces, and new independent states emerged out of it, like Greece in 1821, Romania in 1878, and Serbia in 1878. It was according to the Berlin Agreement, and Bulgaria in 1808. This process of emergence of ethnic states in the Balkans coincided with the process of emergence of independent churches. They came hand in hand. We call independent churches in our tradition autocephalous churches. Autocephalous means self-governed. I have my own head, literally. It means that the church can elect its own primate, its own pope, so to say, without consulting any other church. And this institute is quite old. It goes back to the 6th century, 5th, 6th century. But in the 19th century, it became it was reinvented, so to say. And it was reinvented to reflect the nationalist agenda of the states in the Balkans. So on the one hand, we have emergence of the ethnic states, national states in the Balkans, which were driven by the nationalistic ideas brought to the Ottoman soil from France. On the other hand, we have emergence of independent or autocephalous churches. And these two processes helped each other. So that the process of creating new autocephalies helped new independent states to emerge, and independent states fostered emergence of autocephalous churches. Okay, so it was a kind of a process of mutual support. It developed simultaneously, parallel. Yes, go ahead.
The Old Testament Jews, they also felt that they were chosen by God. They were nationalists.
Yeah, you can say that, but still it was not a nationalism. It was a different thing, because you could become a Jew if you say circumcise. You could become a Jew, which is impossible for, you cannot change your nation, right nowadays in the terms of modern nationalism. But the Jews could, and it was more a matter of covenant. So the Jews, those Jews who kept the covenant with God, were regarded Jews. Something that we find in the Puritan communities in the United States after they arrived to Massachusetts Bay. They had the same idea of chosenness, and they actually, before they stepped to the land of Massachusetts, they signed a covenant with God. And this was a political agreement, essentially. They said that I belong to this community. I want to belong to this community. It means that I accept the rules of this community, which are kind of built on the Bible. And after signing the covenant, they belong to the nation. But again, it was a matter of covenant, not the matter of birth. Who are your parents, or what language you speak, but it was what kind of covenant you have subscribed to. That was exactly the case with the Jews. That's why it was not nationalism. It was even not a nation in the modern sense of the word. If you take even modern Israel, it's so complicated because there are secular Jews who are patriots of Israel, who are even Jewish nationalists, but they're secular, they don't accept Bible, whatever. And they consider themselves belonging to the Jewish nation. So this concept of Jewishness, of nationalism, is completely different from the concept of Jewishness that we see in the Old Testament. So we see the development, evolution of the concept of nation from the Old Testament times to modern era. That's why modern era became crucial, became a milestone in development of these group identities, which we call nations. Okay? And as I said, nationalism became widely spread among the new nations who emerged out of the Turkish Empire. Nationalism was a driving force behind the emancipation from the Turkish authorities. It was a liberation theology, somehow liberation ideology as well. But it had also negative consequences, certainly, for those nations, because they were closed-minded. They became nationalism in all bad sense of the word as we know now. So they became closed-minded, they became exceptionalists, they became not tolerating other nations. They became very much particularist. They started wars between each other. Interesting that those new nations that emerged out of the Turkish Empire soon began wars among each other, because nationalism does not help reconciliation between nations. And they affected the church, these nationalistic ideologies. So we said that nationalism in the modern era, in the French edition of it, became ultimately secular. Then it came back to the Greek soil, say to the Ottoman soil, to the Greek, Serbian, Romanian, and so forth churches, and affected those churches as a secular phenomenon, affected their religious life. And that's how nationalism as a secular phenomenon became implanted to the religious groups, to the churches. The churches early realized the danger of nationalism and they tried to tackle it. This happened for the first time in 1872 when what happened? The Bulgarian community in Istanbul, in the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and beyond, but primarily in Istanbul, wanted independence from the Turks and from the Greeks. Remember, within the Ottoman Empire, there was one single millet, to whom a day of surprises. Now it just switched off everything. The millets embraced different languages and cultures. Bulgars, Serbs, Romanians, Greeks belonged to one Roman millet within the Roman Empire, within the Ottoman Empire, excuse me. And the head of this millet was the Patriarch of Constantinople. He was the ultimate judge for cases within the millet. He had political authority. He had actually, it's interesting that in the system of the millets, the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Christian Patriarch, had more political authority than he had in the Byzantine times, when there was an empire which was, Christian. So that is one of the paradoxes of this system of millets. This meant that the Patriarch, who was Greek in his language and his mentality, was not any more satisfactory with the new ethnic identities within the millet. So the Bulgars who belonged to this millet, they didn't want to have the Patriarch who was Greek upon themselves. They wanted to emancipate not only from the Ottoman Empire, but also they wanted to emancipate from the Greek Church. And that's how they formed their own community, and they declared that community independent in the terms of the church. They declared their church independent. And this church existed in parallel with the Church of Constantinople. They had their bishops and they had their churches in Istanbul, which was the see of the ecumenical patriarchate, the Patriarchate of Constantinople. And this caused a problem, ecclesial problem, which was tackled at the council, which was convened in 1872. This council condemned ethnophilitism, what was called ethnophilitism. Ethnophilitism is essentially a nationalistic ideology. This is when nationalistic ideology drives the church existence, the church people, when it shapes the way how the church functions, when it shapes the structure of the church. This is essentially what was meant under this term ethnophilitism. And it was condemned at the council. This condemnation did mean that this phenomenon ceased to exist. Moreover, the churches which condemned this phenomenon, ethnophilitism, themselves became ethnophiletic. So it was a kind of, it became a kind of epidemic, really, ethnophilitism. So the church condemned it, but it never disappeared. Moreover, it became stronger and affected even those churches which had condemned it. It exists even now, and that's why the council, the Pan-Orthodox Council, which I have already mentioned, which happened in Crete in June this year, it came back to the issue of ethnophilitism and condemned it again. So ethnophilitism is a thing that we hate it, we condemn it, but it's the most spread disease among us. So it's really an epidemic. It's epidemic. Well, nationalism is not just about feelings of national superiority, national exclusivity. It's a complex phenomenon. I already mentioned that nationalism helped the new churches and new states, new nations in the Balkans to liberate themselves from the Ottoman rule. It was really a force capable of liberating a whole nation. Well, the history doesn't know ifs, but imagine if there was no nationalism, what would have happened? Would be there independent Greece or independent Bulgaria or independent any independent nation in Europe? Yeah.
So are you saying like the other side? You mean like the positive?
The positive side. Yeah. Yeah. So it's questionable. Nationalism was strong enough to drive hordes, millions of people literally, to the same cause, to liberate themselves from the oppressive power of the Turks. Well, it is still questionable whether the power of the Turks was so much oppressive. I think it is a bit exaggerated in the posterior propaganda. But nevertheless, people came to believe that the power was oppressive, and people came to believe that they need to liberate themselves from the power. And that was only nationalism which was capable of driving people to their goal. Okay? Another thing is about nationalism. In the Middle Ages, the churches have developed a mentality of strict hierarchization. That there is a hierarchy in the church and in the society, and the distance between the layers of the society, of the medieval society, is huge. In the sociology, it is called stratification. Maybe some of you know this word, this term. Stratification of the society was extremely important in the medieval society, whether it was in the West or in the East. So there was a huge gap between, say, serfs, peasants, craftsmen, knights, nobility, and the king in the medieval European, mostly Western society. This stratification was inspired by religion, because and it came actually from the Christian East. It came from the Neoplatonic background of the Eastern political philosophy, which held the following. Let me explain how hierarchical society, how the society became hierarchical, and what role was played by religion in this process. Christianity brought the message of equality of everyone. There is no difference. There is no social distance. What in the sociology is called social distance between men and women, between children and adult. Something that the classical Roman society, non-Christian Roman society, taken for granted, of the political consciousness of a normal Roman held that man is one species, women is a different species. Women have different nature, and this nature is inferior to the nature of man. The same is with the children. The children have a nature which is inferior to the nature of adult. The same is with the slaves. The majority of the population of the Roman Empire were slaves, up to 80%. And the people believe that to be slave means you are born slave. You cannot be free because it's out of your nature. Your nature is to be slave. Your nature is to be woman. You cannot change gender. In the same way, you cannot change your social status from slave to free. Christianity came to destroy this idea with the message of equality and managed largely to do this, not entirely, because eventually Christianity had to come to a compromise with the Roman ideas of the social distances. New distances were created among the ranks in the church, the hierarchy in the church. So the bishops became kind of similar to senators in the political system of the Roman Empire. Priests became like local administrators. And this hierarchy reflected the social political hierarchy of the Roman Empire. But it was not easy for the Christians, say, to accept these distances, this hierarchy. And then Neoplatonic philosophy came and helped it. The Neoplatonism, essentially, especially at its later stage, it suggested that there is a heavenly hierarchy in the heaven, a hierarchy with distances between the strata of the angels, between the groups of classes of angels. And they receive grace of God from the upper layers of this hierarchy to the lower levels of the hierarchy. So someone who is on the lower level cannot receive grace without taking it from the upper class. This idea of hierarchy, which was articulated in the works of the 6th century Neoplatonic Christian theologian Dionysius the Areopagite, became extremely popular in the political thought in Byzantium and in the West. It was also transplanted to the West. And Dionysius's hierarchy became a model to structure or to justify the existing strata, hierarchical structure of the society, both in the East and in the West. If you see hierarchy on the heaven, you cannot question it on earth. If you believe that there is a hierarchy between the angels, then you cannot doubt the superiority of your master. And this was both in the church and in the society, because the church and the society constituted one thing in the Middle Ages. Now, what nationalism did? Nationalism essentially destroyed these hierarchies. Why? Because if I know that I am of the same blood, I belong to the same nation as my master, as my governor, or as my bishop, we are equal in the nation. This is a destruction of the hierarchy that existed before. This liberates me from this hierarchy. Okay? That was another liberating power of nationalism in the modernity. Yes, Mario?
Would it be more of an illusion?
Sorry?
Wouldn't it be more of an illusion of emancipation from her?
Well, certainly. But people had this. They wanted to believe in this illusion. Certainly. And actually, as a matter of fact, nationalism contributed to shrinking the gaps, the social gaps between the strata within the society and in the church, as a matter of fact. We see how the idea of equality of everyone, this French famous slogan about equality, égalité, when everyone is equal, was facilitated by nationalism. Because if you belong to one nation, then you are on the same rights with other people, regardless of their social status or political status. It was an illusion, probably, but it led to some radical changes in the society. Okay? Is it clear? Yeah.
Is nationalism strictly a sense of superiority?
Yeah, that is the problem, that you are equal within your national group with others. But then, as a group, you feel yourself superior to other groups. That is the downside of the nationalism. So this is an example how a liberating power can turn eventually into a destructive power for others, a power of aggression. Hence are the inter-ethnic wars that started in Europe in the 19th century as a result of the spread of nationalism, when now the ethnic groups began fighting each other.